This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about art markets with Don Thompson, Professor Emeritus of Marketing at York University's Schulich School of Business and author of the $12 million Stuffed Shark, The Curious Economics of Contemporary Art. Don Thompson is Professor Emeritus of Marketing at the Schulich School of Business at York University. His new book, The $12 million Stuffed Shark, dissects the curious economics of the world of contemporary art. Don, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let's start out with a definition of exactly what you mean by contemporary art. That can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. What is in this book your contemporary art?
It typically refers to art created after 1970. Now, I use a slightly different definition, and that is art which is sold as contemporary by Christies or Sothebys in their prestige evening auctions. Now, that means that Gerhard Richter, some of Gerhard Richter's works would be contemporary, and some would be classed as modern. But generally, sold at evening auction and after 1970 covers 95% of it.
So in your book, it's defined essentially by Christies and Sothebys, what is modern, or what is contemporary, excuse me.
Yes.
You're a business professor, and that leaves you no small amount of fascinating things to study. What about contemporary art drew you to it from that perspective of a business professor?
It was the perspective of a business professor. I'm a collector of contemporary art at very, very modest levels. And for years, I've gone to evening auctions at Sotheby's and Christie's and elsewhere, and anybody who's done that, I think, is perplexed by a couple of things. Who are the gatekeepers that determine who will be the artists that make it this level and who won't? But secondly, why are pieces worth 10 or 100 times what I think they should be, given that there's no scarcity factor here? These artists, for the most part, are still alive and still producing. Why do works sell for $5 and $10 and $15 million by living artists? As a business professor, I did not have the slightest idea of the answer. And I had the opportunity to spend essentially a year in London and New York hanging out with auction specialists and dealers and collectors and artists and trying to answer the question. And the book is my answer.
Starting off with the very shark of the title, Damien Hirst's $12 million Stuffed Shark, is that a representative work of this phenomenon you're studying of prices that seem a little high for what the object actually is?
At the time Hearst sold the Stuffed Shark in 2003, it was the second highest price ever paid for a work by a living artist. Second to Jasper Johns. For your listeners, this is the title, the $12 million Stuffed Shark, The Curious Economics of Contemporary Art, is a sort of a metaphor for what's happening in contemporary art, but it is also true. Damien Hirst is a British artist. He is certainly the richest and probably the best-known contemporary artist in the world. In the 90s, he thought that a shark was a good contemporary, good conceptual symbol. He said, it looks dead when it's alive, it looks alive when it's dead. It represents the interface between life and death. And so he had an Australian fisherman catch him a shark, pack it in ice, ship it to the UK. He had it taxidermied and mounted in a tank of formaldehyde. Now, he didn't catch it, he didn't stuff it, he didn't mount it, but he conceived of it, and therefore he is the artist. That's the idea of the conceptual art, which is really the center of what's hot in contemporary art today. So the shark is real. The price is real. The shark at the moment is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where it is the single most asked for and viewed object in the museum. So it hasn't lost its appeal.
You've got the shark, so what other works do you think are representative? You list a few in the book of contemporary art that some might consider confusing or something that they would pay money and not to have to own that ends up getting millions upon millions of dollars bid up and up and up in auctions.
Well, the other item in the book, which has attracted a lot of discussion is Felix Gonzalez Torres. Gonzalez Torres is a New York artist who, in the 90s, whose lover during the 90s had contracted AIDS and died over a period of several years, a particularly painful death. Gonzalez Torres started creating works of art which were piles of either candy or licorice, initially blue and white candies, 355 pounds of candies which were piled in a triangular fashion in the corner of a room. And that was the work of art, sold as a sculpture. Now, lest that sounds silly, these sell in evening auctions for about $600,000, and it's a fair number of them. The idea of it, the conceptual idea of it, was that your guests would come in and they'd take a couple of candies and eat them. And the pile decreasing, the sculpture decreasing, represented his lover's body wasting away. Now, again, you get these two questions. Who chose this as art? And why is it worth $600,000?
In the book you say about that specific piece, the pile of candy, you could go to the store and you could buy some candy. So what sets apart Felix Gonzalez Torres's pile of candy from anyone else's?
You're buying the pile of candy. You're not buying the pile of candy. You're buying the concept, the artist. Now, I say that smiling slightly because one of the book has had remarkably good and consistent reviews, but one of the ones I enjoyed was by the director of Sothebys in London, who wrote that it was a pretty good book, but Thompson clearly didn't appreciate the real meaning of conceptual art because he didn't appreciate Gonzalez Torres. And I guess that's right. The answer I've given you is his answer, but the question you ask is one that I think most people who see this illustrated would ask.
Now, say that this pile of candy, or the shark, the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living, sounds pretty good to me, and I want to own one of these. What would I have to do, assuming I had the money, and maybe was unknown but had the money? How would I acquire one of these pieces? A
shark? Well, Hearst has, I said there's no scarcity to these. Hearst has now made and sold 9 sharks, and he has 2 more in a freezer in London. There are presumably no shortage of sharks in the ocean, nor taxidermists who'll fix them up for you. You would let his major dealers, Larry Gagosian in New York or White Cube in London, know that you were interested, and let the 2 major auction houses let you know if one became available. And one would, in time, I guess, one would become available. Or you would be put in queue to buy the next one Hearst produced.
So if I wanted a major piece of contemporary art, I would have to both contact a dealer and an auction house?
Well, Damien Hirst is unique, and your listeners will have probably read some of this in the last few weeks. Normally, new art is sold through a dealer. The auction houses represent the secondary market, which is to say art that's been owned by someone who's reselling it. And they typically will only deal in work that's 5 years away from being created. Now, Sothebys 3 weeks ago held what may portend a new direction in art and auctions. They auctioned off 223 original Damien Hirst straight from his workshop, for which he bypassed his dealer. So now, presumably, you might buy a piece directly, or through an auction house, as well as through his dealer. But that's Hearst has done that immediately afterwards. Annie Leibovitz followed, but it's still pretty unusual.
Now, I've heard a little bit about, or I should say more than a little bit about, the phenomenon of dealers, their importance diminishing, auction houses eating their lunch, so to speak. Why would that not happen before? Why would auction houses not auction things off directly from established artists before now? Has it just occurred to them, or?
Well, they always have. Most artists, of course, can produce more than their dealers can sell. And so they'll use friends or relatives to slip the odd piece in an auction house. But Hearst was the first one really to do it on a massive scale. You say, look, here's 18 months output. Sotheby's, go with it. There's a mutually dependent relationship between dealers and auction houses. Dealers are the window to collectors for new artists. They find them, they nourish them, they have a couple of early shows which probably lose money, and only when those artists become well known and widely collected by major collectors does their work find their way to evening auctions. So the auction houses rely on dealers, but that relationship, that respect, and having their own territories has broken down. Auction houses now have private dealing departments which do exactly the same thing as dealers. You take the work there and they sell it for you privately. But also they're doing things like this Hearst sale, which both bypasses and weakens dealers.
What is the end result of this, of the weakening of the dealers, of the bypassing of the dealers? How is the overall picture of contemporary art markets different because of the dealer's diminished role?
We don't know yet. The obvious answer is, think of what a dealer does. A major dealer has about 30 artists, represents about 30 artists, and they'll put on a show for each one about every 18 months. And they'll take their work to art fairs and so on. Of those 30 artists, 5 to 7 are ones in which the dealer makes, from whom the dealer makes a lot of money. And there'll be 10 in the middle on which they break even, and there'll be 10 at the bottom who are up and coming, the dealer hopes, on which they probably are losing money. Because the cost of putting on a 3 or 4 week exhibition is the same whether you're selling for $5,000 or $500,000. If you take away the rich sales at the top, you weaken the incentive to subsidize artists at the bottom. And so in the long run, you would think there would be room for fewer spaces for fewer new artists, and probably less long-term support for them if they're not making money.
We've talked about what one should do if they want to buy a piece of contemporary art, but let's look at it from the other angle, the other side. What should someone do, or what does someone do? Someone young who's just graduated art school, what should they do if they want to become the next Damien Hirst, the next huge-selling contemporary artist?
Well, if I had an answer to that, I'd be very popular.
Well, in general terms, not so much a how-to, but how has it been done?
Being a new artist and trying to break into the market is one of the hardest things in any profession that you can imagine. I discuss this in the book, Colin. There's about 40,000 artists in London and 40,000 in New York at any given time seeking representation from a major gallery. In each city, there are probably 35 galleries that you would want to be represented by, who give you that access to major collectors, who give you a window into the world of high-level collecting. Each of those 35 galleries in New York will take on 2 or 3 new artists a year. So there's 70 to 100 new slots for 40,000 artists. Now, one dealer, Victoria Moreau, told me that she looks at these where many dealers don't. She sees 1,000 sets of slides a year, 5 every business day. And she adds 2 or 3 new artists a year, and typically they come from recommendations from collectors or her existing artists, and not from slides. So there are thousands of people wandering the streets of New York or London, knocking on gallery doors and saying, "Please look at my slides." Their chances are virtually zero. About 15,000 of those 40,000 will drop out in any given year and go on to teaching or something else, to be replaced by 15,000 new graduates of art programs who go and seek their fortune.
How different is the situation a young artist finds themselves in? How different is that from the situation that a young entrepreneur who, say, wants to start a tech startup finds themselves in when they're knocking on the doors of venture capitalists saying, "Will you fund my idea?" Is that substantively different, or is this a different game, or just a different shirt on the same sort of player?
No, it's substantively different. If I go to venture capitalists with my new tech idea, the venture capitalists will look at it and say, "Thompson, this is short and that's wrong and this needs to be fixed." And I fix those things and then I come back to him or another one. But a dealer can't say to an artist, "You've got to be a better artist." Right? They just say, "No, this is not for me." If you're looking at 5 of these a day, you can't say much except yes or no. Or maybe focus on this kind of art and come back in a year. But the venture capitalist will give, if there's any hope, will give constructive advice and may provide assistance. So that task is much easier.
So comparatively, searching for VC funding is a lot more forgiving an enterprise, and that is not particularly forgiving. So that says a lot about the difficulty of the young artist, does it not? Now, the Damien Hirst, who we just talked about, he's so much of a success. What can you chalk that up to? Is it something that you think he knew that he had to act on, or is it something that, say, the people surrounding him, the dealers or anyone else that were the catalysts for his success?
Hirst was the founder of what came to be known as the YBAs, the Young British Artists, in the 90s. And now he's the best known because he became most famous, and he's most famous because he became the best known. He went into shock art and conceptual art probably more so than other people, but he wasn't alone. So why did he get where he is? It's hard to say. He and his manager, Frank Dunphy, are the smartest art marketers in the world. I don't know if he's the best artist. I'm not an art critic. I kept finding that out as I spent a year writing the book. But they are the best art marketers, the smartest art marketers in the world, no question. And marketing may be as important as artistic skill in this area.
You use a phrase, shock art. It's one that's very descriptive, I think, of a certain subset of contemporary art. Now, when you're making shock art, what's the risk there? Or maybe this has already happened. You can tell me if you think it has. What's the risk of the edge dulling, where there can't be any more shock art because the boundaries have already been pushed so far that an artist can't find a way to push them any further? Is there an end to shock art, I guess is what I'm asking.
I suppose. Shock art in the UK came to be things like storing 6 or 8 units of your own blood and producing a frozen head, which then had to be displayed, of course, in a freezer. And if the freezer became unplugged, as once happened, which you ended up with a puddle. As you get more into shock art and extreme art, it gets less displayable. There's a limit, I guess, to what most people want to have in their homes. And maybe that's, in the end, the limit, is the marketability.
Which brings up another question about these pieces, these large contemporary art pieces, these shock-based contemporary art pieces that people buy and shell out quite a lot of money for. What do they tend to do with them when they buy? From people you talk to while researching the book, for example, what would they do with these pieces generally?
It's hard to know because the hardest people to interview are collectors. Surprisingly, you think that people in the trade would be more protective of their secrets. But asking a collector how they made a decision to buy something or what they saw in it, or what they're going to do with it, is difficult. I compare it to, if your wife has a friend who's just bought a Birkin bag for $8,000, and you were to ask them, why did you spend $8,000 on this Birkin bag? You can be sure the answer you got is probably not completely accurate, either because they don't want it to be or because they don't really recognize their own motives. The softest spot in the book is collectors' motives, because it's hard to ask the question and it's hard to trust the reliability of the answer.
And on the subject of collectors, how important are these hardcore collectors, these famous collectors, the ones that are shelling out huge amounts every year for contemporary art? How important are they to the market? Could it exist with just a handful of these oligarch collectors, or is the situation different than that?
The book talks about the very highest end, the 1% of the art market, what I call the alternative universe, which bears no relationship to what your listeners see in galleries or buy or have in their homes. At any given evening auction, there may be 400 people in the room. There are only 20 to 30 who will bid. The others are just an audience. They're part of the set of this stage play. And there'll be another 30 who will bid by telephone. And a lot of those are bottom feeders who will put up their hand either to pretend to be players or in hope that a bargain is there to be had. For any given work of art, the auctioneer says he knows, and almost always a man, who the last 3 or 4 bidders will be. Everything that leads up to those last 3 or 4 is just part of the stagecraft. So they're very important. What led to the huge boom in the contemporary art market over the last 5 years was the influx of about 20 new major Russian bidders. If you have 2 or 3 bidders for a piece and you add another 1 or 2, it makes a huge difference. And that's particularly if these are people who aren't used to losing and who are very wealthy. One of the things you learn is how wealthy is.
At the top 1% of the art buying market, then how much of it is the desire to win versus the desire simply to own something that someone finds aesthetically pleasing? Is it a lot of just competition and purely competition at that top end?
Again, it's hard to know motives, but at the Hearst auction 3 weeks ago, Hearst had sold probably 25 works at auction in the previous year, averaging about $475,000 a piece. He sold 218 of the works offered in London, average about $970,000 a piece. So the average work sold for twice what it had sold for in the previous year. About 3/4 of the works at auction an equivalent could have been bought within 10 kilometers of the auction house for half what people paid for them at auction. Now, part of that may be competition or not wanting to lose, but part of it is the dual branding. This is my Damien Hirst, which I bought at a Sothebys evening auction. When somebody sees that, Damien Hirst produces spot paintings, which are just rows of spots on canvas. He doesn't produce them, a technician does. Now, if I put that on my wall, Colin, and you came into my home and I said, "Hey, Colin, that's my set of spots for which I paid $500,000, you'd probably say, "Thompson, you're an abject fool." I'm not sure I want you as a friend. But if I say to you, "Colin, this is my Damien Hirst, which I purchased at a Sotheby's evening auction," you will say, "Thompson, you are a man of cutting-edge taste and wealth." It's like the Birkin bag. Nobody says to your wife's friend, "Geez, that's an ugly piece of leather." They say, "Wow, it's a Birkin bag. You are a woman of taste, culture, and wealth."
So the buyers are buying not so much the specific piece of art as they're buying Sotheby's or buying Christies in many instances?
They're buying a brand. And if you buy a Hearst at an evening auction, you're buying a dual brand, a double brand. And that must be one explanation for why people will pay twice as much for a dot painting at auction as they could get it for in a gallery 10 kilometers away the same day.
This is a question that I know some listeners are going to want me to ask, and it's something you cover in your book, so this works out. Could you explain what separates Christie's from Sotheby's and vice versa?
Well, very little. They're the two of them combined have about 90% of the high-end world auction market. They are the branded places to buy high-end art, not just contemporary art, but art of almost all kinds. And they operate around the world. Christie's is privately owned, and Sotheby's is publicly traded, although its stock has gone straight through the floor in the last 6 months. And so they operate somewhat differently. They have different risk tolerances. Christie's now is a little more free in giving guarantees and maybe taking chances on work, but essentially they're the same. You'll find the same kinds of work. You'll find the same buyers at both. Consigners choose one of the two of them based on just negotiating terms rather than reputation.
Now, what makes it so difficult for a third auction house to rise up to the ranks of that Christie's and Sotheby's have attained? Is it the case that, can I make this analogy, that Christie's and Sotheby's are like Coke and Pepsi, and say a Bonhams is more like an RC Cola, just sort of condemned?
That's a good analogy. Bonhams and Phillips de Perry would be the next two on that list, but they're RC Cola and 7-Up, and they tend to handle a lower value of art. They tend to handle the sort of middle market art that's below what Christie's and Sotheby's would take. Remember, each of the evening auctions will have about 65 works, and there are hundreds of works submitted by people who would like to sell through them. And they'll say, sorry, it doesn't fit in our evening auction. We might put it in a day auction or in a secondary auction. And at that point, Phillips, DePury, and Bottoms come into play. But they probably don't compete much for consignments for the best works that are going into evening auctions at Sothebys and Christies.
When people think about art auctions that have never been to an actual art auction, I think that a lot of that impression has been constructed by movies, TV, novels, and what have you. But in your research going to art auctions, what about them is the most different from what people think they are?
I'm not sure what people think they are. I think many people go to art evening auctions to be seen. Just watching people spend millions of dollars is theater. And I've gone to auctions just as theater. It's pretty entertaining. Probably the greatest surprise is the anonymity of it. You often can't tell who's bidding. People will bid by touching their tie or by touching their glasses or by taking their glasses off or by nodding their head, a signal only the auctioneer recognizes. And of course, half or more of the bids come by telephone. Now, some of those telephone calls are from the audience. They're people on mobiles calling the auction house. Sometimes to hide their identity, but sometimes just to slow down the pace. The auctioneer wants to elicit a bid every second and a half, which they say is time enough to react, but not time enough to think. And so you can sit there through an entire couple of items being bid and have no idea as to who's bidding or who bought them, except that the paddle numbers announced at the end.
What do you actually see going on when these invisible bidders are doing their thing?
Where you'd like to be is about 10 rows back in the middle. It gives you a kind of a V-shaped view of the people ahead of you. It's very bad taste to turn around and stare at the person who's bidding. People do it, but it is considered to be in bad taste. If you sit 10 rows back with a kind of a V-shaped view, you'll have some sense, because the first, probably 6 or 7 or 8 rows are reserved seats, either because you're a celebrity or because, in fact, you're bidding and the auctioneer wants to see you. So you see, what do you see? You see the art of the auctioneer, and it's a very skilled activity. You see the work being brought in, and you see the 30 people manning telephones on one side of the room, taking bids and relaying bids, and at one point trying to talk one more bid out of the bidder, and also trying to signal to the auctioneer how, probably the identity of the bidder, but also how serious they seem to be. If they're serious, the auctioneer may slow down and wait for an additional bid. So you get a sense of what's happening without necessarily seeing the players.
One of the more surprising things to me is that in your book you say that there are actually specific auctioneers that someone will demand auction off the specific piece of art they're selling. There are celebrity auctioneers. What does it take? What goes into a celebrity auctioneer? What separates them from your run-of-the-mill art auctioneer?
It is thought the best auctioneers at each of the major houses, on average, can probably get 10% more for a given work than an ordinary auctioneer would be, and probably 3 times as much as you or I would. They know the bidders, they know their mannerisms, they know when to urge an additional bid and when to back off. They know when to ask the bidder if they want to come back in. They understand. I use the example in the book of Jussi Pelkonen, who's a Christies auctioneer in London, who uses the term regret, and will say, regret is this unhappiness the next morning and having lost a piece that you thought would be yours. And every bidder understands it. Every auction goer understands it. And he will use terms like no regrets now, and often bring someone back in who has dropped out. So it's a skill. It really is a skill. And it's fun to watch. It's the skill that an actor has on stage.
Now, speaking of Christies and Sotheby's and the importance of brands in the art world, one of the lessons of your book, one of the big takeaways for me, seems to be that in art, brands are everywhere. Everything seems to be able to be a brand and an important one. What else is important as a brand besides auction houses? For example, collectors. What's the importance of branded collectors?
Well, if you look at an auction catalog, beside each work there's a list of what they call a provenance. Where has the art been before it reached this auction? If it has been owned by a major museum, it's probably worth 50% more than it would be without that previous ownership. If it's been owned by a movie star, it's worth more. If it's been in a major exhibition, a museum, it's worth more. If it's been owned by Eli Broad, would be a good example in Los Angeles, who is known to be a collector of taste and skill, it is worth more. It's hard to think of many other things that are worth more because of who owned them previously, but it is true with high-level art, and it can literally increase the price by a couple of $1 million.
If you're just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio at colinmarshallradio.com, where you'll find our complete show archive. My guest is Don Thompson, Professor Emeritus of Marketing at York University's Schulich School of Business and author of The $12 Million Stuffed Shark, The Curious Economics of Contemporary Art.
It's hard to say whether this goes back. It does. It goes back to the last century in the sense of, a royal family, which was disposing of art. You know, a work owned by the King of Spain in the last century would certainly bring a considerable premium over one that was owned by an unknown. But probably not on the scale it does today. To the point where look at an art catalog, and if it was owned by nobody at all of distinction, it will simply say owned by a lady or owned by a gentleman. Of course it was. Well, what else is there? But probably on the scale it is now, is probably an activity of the last 30 or 40, 50 years. It gets to the point where if I were going to sell a work of art and give the money to my local art museum, the Chicago Museum of Art, I am better off to donate the work to the Chicago Museum of Art and let them submit it. They can take it down and let it spend a day in their storage vaults. They can consign it to auction, and it will now say, from the collection of the Chicago Museum of Art. And that will bring a 20 or 30% premium over my consigning it. Now, so the museum gets more money, and I get a bigger tax deduction. And that does happen.
Now, the role of museums themselves is something I wanted to make sure to ask about, because reading all this about art changing hands from auction houses to collectors to other big-name collectors, I started to wonder, well, museums are where so many people encounter art. How does art actually end up on the wall of a museum? Contemporary art, the kind that's trading for such large sums at Christies, at Sothebys.
The high prices of contemporary art now, for the most part, have shut museums out of the buying process. Most American museums rely on donations. Now, they will, having said that, they will buy, the work they buy tends to be from dealers and tends to be of up-and-coming artists, because those are the only artists they can afford. And so they'll take a chance and they'll buy half a dozen works, and if the artist doesn't turn out as they expected, they can always sell them. But that's the only period in which they can afford them. The major works tend to come through donors over time. Now, that has an interesting effect, too. Most donors would like their work to be hung, and so they'll try and donate it with a provision that it must always be shown. That, when it is accepted, produces a museum where the work you see on the wall is not that chosen by the curator, it's that chosen by the donor. Artists will often donate a work on the agreement that it must always be shown. So in that case, it's not the work the curator might have purchased to illustrate that artist. It's the work the artist chose to be shown. And every time wall space is occupied by a work with that provision, there's one less space for a new acquisition. So over time, it distorts a bit what the museum is showing you. But when you get works costing millions of dollars, it's really the only way the museum has to make an acquisition.
Where do the other players, the ones who are not quite operating on the level of power that a branded collector is, where do, say, the art journalists that you cover and art critics that you cover in the book, where do they fall in this? Do they have any effect whatsoever?
The general assumption is they don't. But, when you read an art critic in your local paper or in a regional paper, an art magazine, you get a sense of they're not writing for me. I don't know who they're writing for, but it isn't me, for two reasons. One is most critics hate to be very critical of first-time exhibits, first-time artists, so they're kind to everybody. But also they emphasize uniqueness and innovation, whereas what you're probably looking for is what do I want to see in my home? What will touch my soul? What represents good drawing and good coloration and good composition, and will have an impact on me? And that's not what most critics are discussing when they write criticism. Even some of the major critics, I quote one in the book who says, if I write a great review, it has no impact. If I write a really bad review, it has no impact. And if I don't write at all, it still doesn't have any impact. And that's probably true for most critics and most artists.
What about, say, the very, very major critics? For example, I was delighted that you included a lot of quotes from Robert Hughes, who is one of the best-known living art critics and one of my favorite writers, I think, about anything. But even Hughes, he will go on and on about how little he likes Damien Hirst or how little he likes Jeff Koons. But that's not really making a perceptible dent in their prices, is it?
Hughes wrote a scathing review of Hurst and his work 2 weeks before the Hurst auction. Hurst auction brought $200 million over 2 days. It was by a factor of 20 the biggest single artist auction ever held. And yet that Hughes review was cited in a dozen different newspapers and reviews. Didn't seem to have much impact. I agree with you on Robert Hughes. Fun to read, but it doesn't seem to affect buyers.
At least it's not affecting buyers on the level that's so high that a buyer would be buying a Damien Hirst piece. Would you say that a critic like Hughes has more clout among the lower 99%?
Of artists? Hard to say. No one comes into a gallery and says, I'm interested in this because Hughes liked it. And nobody ever says to the gallerist, I didn't come to your gallery because Hughes panned this work. It's very hard to know. I think as you move down the price scale, people are obviously less affected by brand and they're more affected by just the visceral impact on their souls that a particular piece of work has. And so there again, critics may not be important.
I imagine that among the top 1% of buyers, there is nobody there who is purely buying on their own aesthetic instinct. If you were doing that, you wouldn't be there, correct or wrong?
I don't know. Again, the question of motive is very hard to get at.
Right.
And I try to stay away from the book. It's just a very difficult thing to elicit.
Now, when you were doing the research for this book and doing interviews and investigating into the art world is something that a lot of people see as a bit mysterious, a bit secretive. How hard is it? What are the challenges of getting in there and asking questions and getting the answers you want out of art people?
Less difficult probably than I thought. And part of that is that there's a lot of movement in the area. Auction houses, for example, pay very, very badly. And if you look at their advertisements in art magazines and so on, you'll get a sense of that. And so there's a huge amount of movement. I probably ran into 40 people who were ex-auction specialists at either Christies or Sothebys who were now doing something else and were prepared to talk, not secret, of course, but just talk in general about what they did and how things operated and what other people did. And so over time, you get a fairly complete picture. Dealers are quite happy to talk about other dealers, if not themselves. And so, you go around half a dozen dealers and each talks about the other five, and you get a bit of a picture of what's happening.
What, while writing the book, did you find that, or from responses to, say, early drafts, what did you find that people really wanted to know about the art world? What information did you think that readers would really, really want out of your research and out of your book that they weren't getting anywhere else?
Well, I wrote the book for myself. I wrote the book really to answer the questions I talked about earlier. My third question was why is this art? But I learned early on that I wasn't going to ever answer that question. That it is in the eyes of the beholder. My questions were, what is the process by which these artists who make it to the very top did so? It doesn't seem to be skill in drawing or coloration. It doesn't seem to be technical skill. If you look at an early Picasso, at the line drawings he did when he was 14 years old, he was brilliant. They blow you away. His work evolved in different directions, but his underlying skill was phenomenal. And you don't necessarily get that sense with contemporary art. So if that's not it, then what determines who makes it to the top, and what determines prices? And those are, I think, the questions that everybody who walks through a gallery with their mouth open and says to the gallerista, "Who buys this stuff?" And you're charging what? It's the questions that everybody kind of has in their mind, I have a PhD and I teach in a major business school, and I'm supposed to know the answers, and I didn't have the remotest idea. Those are the questions I set out to get an answer to.
After doing all the work for the book, after writing the book, do you look at contemporary art now do you look on it more fondly, or how has it changed the way you look at contemporary art versus what you thought before whenever you would walk into a contemporary gallery?
It's probably broadened somewhat my tastes and my acceptance. Over a year, I looked at thousands of pieces. What I realized early on is, and your listeners will have had this experience. If I go to the preview of a major auction, there are 65 pieces on preview, and I can spend a couple of hours with them. Almost nobody likes more than 2 or 3 of the 65. In the sense, you'd like to take them home and hang them on your wall and live with them and see them every morning. And there'll be another dozen works there that you would pay not to have to take home. What an economist calls a negative price. It's like saying, what would you pay to not have your son get that dragon tattoo on his forehead? There are a dozen works that you don't want anywhere near you. But somebody will bid high on all of those, and most of them will be sold, and people will take them home. So, taste is as diverse as the people who are in that auction room. And the same thing is true in a gallery. Even if you go and see an artist you like, and there's 30 works on display in your favorite gallery, you might see 2 or 3 that you would, if you could afford it, would buy and take home. And a bunch that you wouldn't want near you, but they'll all sell. You quickly stop saying, why do other people have tastes different than mine? They just do. There's a diversity of taste, and it's reflected by the diversity of art.
We talk about how there's a buyer for each piece of art, but just because I have a journalistic obligation to be topical here, considering the current financial and economic situation, it's looking less than rosy. Has there been an effect on the art market because of that, or is the art market, at least at the top 1% we've been discussing, is that a world apart from whatever else is going on unless things get really, really dire?
No, the contemporary market has deflated badly in the last few weeks. 3 weeks ago, you had the Frieze Art Fair, one of the 4 major art fairs in the world in London. Sales were about 60% of what they had been the previous year at Frieze, over the week or so it was open. But at the end of Frieze, you had 3 evening contemporary auctions at Sothebys, Christies, and Phillips de Paris. And they were disasters. Half the works unsold. And something we hadn't anticipated, the expectation as to what would happen with this financial crisis to the market, is that the middle market works, all but the very most expensive works, would go soft. But that the very best works would hold their value, because there are about 100 new museums, or major contemporary art museums in the world being constructed and filled with art. If you just look at 4 of those, there's 2 of them in Abu Dhabi, there's one in Sharjah, also in the United Arab Emirates, and there's one in Qatar. Those 4, between them, will add about 500 museum-quality works of contemporary art per year, 125 each. And that kind of demand from museums should prop up the very top end of the market. And lo and behold, it did not. What happened, reportedly, was that after all these works had failed at auction, these buyers came forward to the auctioneer and said, look, here are 3 works I liked a lot. Please offer the consignor 20% below your minimum estimate. And if they accept it, I'll take it. Even buyers at that level are assuming prices will come down and are behaving that way. So we'll see what happens.
How does the contemporary art market respond differently to outside economic forces than not another market completely, but just in comparison to, say, non-contemporary art, we'll call it, say the old masters? What's the difference there in how markets respond? Is contemporary more volatile or less?
It's much more volatile. Most old masters are in museums and never to emerge again. There just aren't very many major Rembrandts in private hands to where the owner's financial problems would cause them to be sold. And if they were, each of those owners has 4 or 5 offers from auction houses and dealers and museums saying, if you ever want to sell that, come to me. If it was sold, we probably wouldn't know about it. It would be placed privately and it would change hands and we might not know until it appeared on the wall of a museum 6 months from now. But the problem with contemporary art is if there is a financial crisis, people start dumping it, then the market goes to hell quickly. There are a couple of people in the market who own more than 150 Damien Hirsts. There are a couple of people out there who own more than 150 Andy Warhols. And if collectors like that were seen to be dumping for financial reasons, nobody wants to be the second to sell. Everybody wants to be the first. And 1990 was the last great art market crash. And it crashed because when Japanese collectors started dumping art, everybody tried to dump art. And there were lots of sellers and no buyers. If that happens, all bets are off. Who knows what will happen to the market over the next 5 years. I said that Sothebys stock it's become a disaster. It's dropped from $60 to $8 in a period of months. Probably on the expectation that that's what's going to happen.
How good an investment vehicle, and speaking purely from an investment point of view, ruling out cachet, ruling out aesthetics, ruling out meaning, all of that, how good is contemporary art as an investment vehicle alone?
Terrible.
Terrible.
What you hear and read about are the successes. If I buy a work for $200,000 and sell it 2 years later for $1 million, it probably makes the Los Angeles Times. But if I buy it for $1 million and sell it for $200,000, nobody writes it up, and I don't tell anybody. 80% of art purchased from a dealer will never resell for that amount, ever. Not next year, not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, never. Half the major dealers who are around today will be gone in 20 years. Half the major artists who are being sold at auction today will not be being sold at major auction 20 years from now. You hear about the successes. You don't hear about the failures. So it's a little like oil wells. You drill 40 wells, and the one that hits gets a lot of publicity, and the 39 that are dry don't get any. I devote the last chapter of the book to saying if you really want to invest in art, here's how you might consider going about it. But realistically, buy art because you love it. Buy it because it touches your soul. Don't buy it as an investment.
And speaking of, we're almost out of time, but I certainly wanted to ask you this. Since you mentioned you are a buyer of art yourself, if indeed you have one, what is your own art buying strategy?
Things that touch my soul and my wife's soul. And, you have collections of things you like, and if you're lucky, they overlap. When you find something that overlaps and you can barely afford it, you buy it.
Would you say that when buying art, just buy for yourself, buy for your response to the actual piece, and then if it goes up in value, that's just gravy, that's something you shouldn't be expecting, but it's kind of nice if it happens? If
it touches your soul and you want to live with it, you don't want to sell it. You want to give it to your children and hope it touches them too. Sure, it's nice to think it'll hold its value. And, if I had a Richard Diebenkorn that I had bought in the 60s and it was worth $7 million today, I'd probably sell it because I couldn't justify having $7 million on my wall. But buy it because you love it.
So would this be a good articulation of the rule, buy what you'll never want to sell?
Sure.
The book, once again, is The $12 Million Stuffed Shark, The Curious Economics of Contemporary Art. Don Thompson, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Colin.
Our music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his stuff at benalthouse.com. Find out more about the Marketplace of Ideas or visit our online show archive at colinmarshallradio.com.